this is Kyle, also known as Alien Dude, reviewing today this sword and scabbard made by Eric Estlund of Winter Cutlery. This sword is named the Salzritter, which means the Salt Knight, if I remember right. Eric has a little bit of a story about how he came up with that. I will put it in a comment below because I'm not going to remember the whole story just to repeat it off right now. So you should know that this is not my sword. It is a loaner sent to me from Eric for the purposes of this review and to get feedback from me, feedback from the community, as well as get his name out there some, because Winter Cutlery is not a name that a lot of people are familiar with. I did review another sword that he had sent me, the Shalia. I reviewed that about 4 weeks ago. I will put a link to that up here and in the description. Now, this sword and scabbard package sells for $5,000 on Winter Cutlery's website. That's a lot of money, obviously. You do get the complete package here, and it is available to buy now. As of release of this video, the sword is still in my possession, but it'll be getting back to Eric in a couple weeks. So if you were to buy it, you will get it relatively quickly, although not immediately. And if you want to get a chance to experience Mr. Estlund's work in person without having to pay multiple thousands of dollars to buy it, he is going to be at the XVIIIc Custom Knife Show in California on April 25th and 26th of 2025. So that's a good opportunity to see his work in person. So Eric did pair this sword with a scabbard here. And I want to talk a little bit about this scabbard in a manner of how much is it worth? Because scabbards are expensive to get well done. And this scabbard, let me just go over it real quick, is absolutely gorgeous. The leather is very nicely fitted to the core. The core is slender. There's a linen wrap underneath the leather. And overall, there's just the fundamentals. It's very slender here. The fit is beautiful. The draw is beautiful. Hold it upside down, shake, doesn't come out. Takes no effort to draw at all, though. It's overall an utterly functional scabbard. It works very well. Now, let's take a look at the details here. This kind of like, not floral, but like plant-like pattern on here is inspired by historical leather work, and the texture behind that, I can't think of what it's called right off the top of my head. Stippling, maybe? It's really, really well done. And it's incredibly crisp. All of this is incredibly, very crisply done, very well defined. So let's talk about the price of a scabbard like this. So if I'm going to look at the price, one of the most important things to do is look at the amount of time that's put into it. This kind of hand embossed design takes a lot of work, a lot of effort. And then the next thing is to do is look at how well executed it is. Let's compare this to this other scabbard I have. This is from DBK, who is widely considered the best scabbard maker in the business. I would say Brian, DBK, has a little bit more crispness, certainly more detail, especially in like painting and that kind of thing, more depth to the dye. But the overall look is remarkably close from Eric to DBK. And overall, I think this scabbard is maybe not quite up to the level of DBK, but just underneath it. And there's not many makers who are at that level at all. I would expect a scabbard like this to cost around $2,000. If I were to commission a scabbard from somebody, you could even get this a plain scabbard from DBK for $2,000, by the way. His prices start above that. So this level of detail, of precision and fit and function is really exceptional, and it stands out in the market. This adds a lot of value to the entire package of the sword. So if we're, like I was saying, I think the scabbard would be around $2,000 to commission from somebody. Theoretically, Eric doesn't take scabbard commissions, but if he did, I would say this would be around $2,000. That means the Scabbard 2000, that brings the sword down to around $3,000. So we'll talk about that more when I get into the bottom line. I just really did want to talk and really exemplify or really explain why I think this Scabbard adds a lot of value to the sword package and why it may not be quite appreciated of how much it adds to the overall cost. One more thing to add on to that. It's perfectly fine if you don't value scabbards at that kind of level. Some people don't even value scabbards at all, really. To me, on a high-end sword especially, a high-end scabbard is part and parcel of it. It doesn't have to necessarily be decorated, but a well-made scabbard completes the sword. If you don't value a scabbard, obviously you're not going to want to pay something like $2,000 for this. And that's fine. Everybody has different tastes, expectations, and what they want. I would just say though, if you don't value a scabbard highly, Eric Estlund is probably not the best person to consider for your sword because he does like to make scabbards for his swords. So let's move on to the hilt and start with the pommel. This is a wheel pommel or disc pommel. It's got a small circular peen block here. The finish on it is pretty shiny. It's got a little bit of a dullness to it. It's not completely bright. I can certainly see my face in it, but it's a little fuzzy. And that's not just my stubble. There is a little bit of taper in thickness from the grip towards the pommel, or towards the peen, but very, very minor. It does dome out a little bit, but not a lot, just a little bit. And the corners, despite being crisp, are not sharp at all. So it's very easy to grip. If you want to grip the pommel, separate the hands, it's incredibly comfortable. This is very nicely smoothed over, and it creates a very comfortable way to grip if you like gripping the pommel. Overall, it's a really nice one. Now there is a little bit of some scuffs in the finish here, a little bit of, you can see the grain in the metal a little bit more than I am used to, and that's going to be a common thing throughout this sword. But the pommel is well executed. It looks right across the entire sword, and it's a good one. The peen is very cleanly done. It's a robust peen. It's round. There's no errant hammer marks. It's cleaned up very well. Overall, a good job. The grip is about 9 inches long, and it's got just a little bit of a swell right in here, which is kind of an interesting place. And then it tapers back down into more of a cylindrical dimension, like right there. And it has just the tiniest of swell in this dimension before tapering just the tiniest bit. It's a little bit longer in the offhand than I'm used to seeing, but it works really well. The leather work here is, again, very well done. The leather feels incredibly comfortable in the hand. It gives me a really good grip. I can't rotate my hand at all. So locks into the hand very well. The risers are done nice and crisply. The transition, especially to the pommel, very well done. And it brings us to this rein shape, flap, whatever you want to call it, which is very well executed as well. It has embossing on it that matches the scabbard, and it's quite stiff. I can move them around a little bit, but most of the time when I see these, which is not often enough, frankly, but most of the time they're quite floppy, frankly. These are not. These are quite rigid. There's enough leather there and enough treatment of the leather to make it pretty stiff. Now, I happen to really love these integrated rein flaps, rein shapes. It lets you thumb the blade without getting the thumb on the blade, so you get less chance of rust and corrosion from your skin oils, anything like that. And they just look so classy. I really like the way they look. And the crossguard here has quite a bit of dimension to it. It has a lot of facets to it, flares out while also tapering in thickness. And overall, everything here is very crisp and well defined. These corners are pretty sharp. So you could, if you were going to do like a Mordhau, murder stroke where you grip the blade and strike with either the pommel or the crossguard, this would not feel good to get hit by. So there is that. You could also theoretically punch with it, I guess. Overall, the crossguard is really well done. If we look at the gap where the blade meets it, it's very, very, very minimal. Not much gap there at all. Overall, just a really well executed design. And again, it just looks right. I mentioned this in my previous review of a Winter Cutlery sword, the Shalia. There's something about Eric's work that I think just looks right and authentic to medieval swords, and this sword is no exception. And now it's time to talk about the business end. As usual, here's my measurements. So you can see that this is a big and relatively heavy blade at around 3 pounds 10 ounces. It starts wide, has pretty gentle profile taper throughout most of the blade, and then towards the tip it does taper in more, creating a pretty acute point. The distal taper is a little bit interesting. It starts at the thickest point, obviously, at the crossguard, rapidly tapers in the first couple inches, and then maintains that same thickness through much of the blade before tapering again in thickness out towards the tip. It's a little bit different. It's non-linear. It doesn't just go down in one smooth motion. It tapers quickly, kind of stops the taper, and then goes again. So non-linear distal taper, but overall it does work out pretty well. When looking at close-up details on the blade, you can definitely tell that this is handmade because there's little bits of asymmetries, little bits of signs of being handmade. The tip is definitely not perfectly symmetrical. The finish has a little bit of some grind lines left here and there, but overall the finish is a little bit rougher than what I would prefer at this price point. It's got just a little bit of cleanup that I think could be done, especially there's a couple spots on the center ridge where you can see some grind lines, and some towards the edge you can see some leftover grind lines from the sharpening, and it's all stuff that could be used to be cleaned up. And my hunch is, when I send this back to Winter Cutlery, my hunch is that Eric is going to clean those up since I pointed them out here. I could be wrong. That's just my hunch. Eric is under no obligation to do that. But overall, the finish on the blade is brighter than a typical satin, but it's not a full mirror. Now, I can definitely see reflections in it, but they are a little bit fuzzy. And it's also got a very minor micro bevel, what I would consider micro bevel. It's definitely not a secondary bevel, but you can definitely see where the sharpening was done. And the sharpening could be slightly evener. It's very effective. We'll get to that in a little bit, but you can see some variance in the edge just looking at it under light. And it would be nice at this price point for it to be just a touch more cleaned up. But of course, that's just my aesthetic taste. There are plenty of people who prefer seeing little bits of roughness and those telltale signs of the handmade nature. So whether or not you like that or not, that's up to you. For me, I would like to see it cleaned up a little bit more because this is a very expensive sword. But even with those, I hesitate to call them flaws, but even with those things I've noticed, this is a beautiful blade. It has such an elegant look to it. Despite being big and beefy, it looks elegant. And while it's not exactly like the Principe, which is another 18C and the one most people are going to be most familiar with, this is a bit of a different take. It doesn't have quite as wide of a base. It has less profile taper, but it is absolutely right there in the historical norms for an 18C, and it looks right for that type. Before moving on, a small bit of shameless self-promotion. Did you know I have a web store at alien2.com? If you want to support the channel and get a little bit of swag, check that out. You can go get a hoodie like this, t-shirt, face mask, a variety of stuff, all branded with the Alien 2 logo. It's a great way to support the channel, and as always, 25% of the profit of any sale will be donated to the American Cancer Society. Moving on to cutting, let's first do a little bit of paper cutting. It's something I haven't been doing much recently, and I'm not really sure why. I don't know why I stopped it, but let's do it here. So it struggled to make the initial cut right out here, but once I got right to the sweet spot, it cut right into the paper. Very easily cutting into the paper there. Very easy. So this sword is quite sharp. It's definitely got a keener edge than was on the other Winter Cutlery sword that I reviewed, the Shalia, but that's fully intentional. You know, Eric put thought into what kind of edge he put onto each of his swords, and this one is very clearly quite sharp. I would say it's sharp enough just barely to compete with if I wanted to, but if I were to compete with it, I would like to get it honed up just that last little bit more in the evenness of the sharpening than really the actual sharpness itself. But anyways, let's move on to my normal targets. So in the backyard, I did my normal targets. I don't think I need to go into what they are, why I cut them, because I have talked about it before. On the other hand, if you want to see me do a video about the types of targets I cut in the backyard and what I can learn from those targets, let me know in the comments. Maybe I'll do a video on that. So this sword cuts light targets in the backyard and heavier targets very, very well. It has a very effective edge. I just demonstrated that. And it moves and cuts cleanly, easily, and with a very satisfying feel to it. Some swords, when you do a cut and it's a good cut, it still doesn't feel particularly satisfying. This one has that nice clean sound when it cuts through the target, and it's just like a snick. I don't know how to describe it any better than that, but this sword has that. It really does feel fun when you get those clean cuts. And because it has a good sharpness, good edge geometry, and good blade geometry for cutting, it's pretty easy to get good clean cuts with this sword. And then moving on to tatami, the same pretty much thing. It is sharp enough to cut tatami, no doubt. I can get some very good cuts with it. Now, when I was doing this cutting, I was pretty rusty. This was my first time cutting tatami in like 2 or 3 months, so I was rusty. And I got a few good cuts. I had some more flubbed cuts, but I was flubbing cuts all over the place that day. I can't blame the sword for that, because when my technique was on, it delivered beautiful cuts. So it's a very good tatami cutter. Not quite competition level sharp in my opinion, but it's certainly sharp enough to do the job. And if your techniques are on, you're really not going to notice the tiny, tiny bit sharper that it could be. So it could be competition level sharp if your technique's really good. In my hands, I would want that little bit of extra sharpness to give me, to make up for my flaws a bit more. But overall, this is a lot of fun to cut with, and it's very effective as well. All right, let's talk about how this sword handles. So first off, it is balanced relatively close to the crossguard at around 4 inches, that looks like to me, 3.5, 4 inches. I have the measurement on the graphic I put up earlier. And then the center of percussion, it's right around 2/3 of the way up the blade, right where you want it to be. It does have a decent amount of flex while still remaining mostly rigid throughout the blade. And the percussion note in the hilt, it's right up here, right where, about where my thumb is resting. A good spot for it. So those fundamentals are done well. Let's see if it generates any sword wind. You heard my wrist crack there on the first one, but there is a little bit of sword wind. Not a ton, but it is there. I can't really get the sword going fast in here because I'm just going to strike the ground, hit my ceiling fan, hit the walls. You get the point. So it does have some sword wind, but it's not a particularly loud sword. But how does it feel to move around? So with that point of balance being a little bit further out than, say, the Principe, which we'll get to in a minute, it does feel a little bit more authoritative in the cut while not feeling weighty or point heavy, anything like that. It is 3 pounds, 10 ounces. definitely on the high side for a longsword, but not egregiously high. And overall, it moves very, very well. I can, stop the cut easily without having it feel like it's dragging on my wrists or anything like that. If I try to deliver the tip, yep, goes pretty much right where I want it to go without a whole lot of difficulty. Yeah, I can get the tip where I want it to go pretty easily. So it feels pretty nice for both cutting and thrusting. Now, if I want to start a cut and then redirect, easy to do. If I want to do a double cut, yep, quick and easy. Again, I have to be very careful how I'm swinging, so the technique and the speed is way off for this, obviously. But overall, it moves well, and it is a nimble sword, and it's surprisingly usable in one hand. I can stop the cut one-handed without too much effort. Now I am starting to feel that a little bit in my arms and wrists, and that's probably more age than anything else. But it does move around in one hand well enough to use one-handed, which is impressive for a 3-pound, 10-ounce sword. That's very high for an arming sword, not outside the range of believability historical swords, but it's not a particularly comfortable weight normally for an arming sword for me. And this is actually quite usable in one hand. And if we talk about how the sword pivots, yeah, it pivots very nicely. I've talked about this some on other swords where I say it doesn't quite pivot right. And I don't know if I'm explaining that very well. But basically, when I'm talking about pivoting, I'm trying to describe the way the sword's weight is distributed. Because on a sword where the weight is not distributed properly, where there's oftentimes not enough distal taper, a sword will pivot in an odd spot where it won't. You see, God, I'm doing a terrible job explaining this. But basically, having less weight out here means it pivots further back, and therefore this is further away from the pivot point. Therefore, the tip is easier to accelerate. Whereas if the tip is heavy feeling and the pivot point moves up here, the way a lever works, this is going to be moving slower. So it's more difficult to accelerate the tip, and it doesn't feel right accelerating it. This feels right. And comparing it to the Principe, I pick up the Principe. First thing I notice is that the grip is considerably bulkier. I talked about the Principe's grip in my previous review, so if you haven't seen that, I'll link it in the description. It's a heavier sword. It doesn't feel heavier. And let's do a quick side-by-side of the blades. The Winter Cutlery is a little bit longer. It looks like it's probably a little bit less wide at the base, but pretty similar at the sweet spot. Maybe a little bit less acute of a tip, but not that much. So let me put down the Salzritter. So I pick up the Principe, and just when I'm moving it around, this feels like a quicker sword. It's heavier, but it feels a little bit quicker and lighter because that balance point is even closer on this. This is a notably close point of balance here. But yeah, this is easier to pivot and easier to accelerate the tip, but not egregiously so, not like the Salzritter is wrong. Just this is a different take on a 18C. The Salzritter has a bit more forward point of balance, a bit more power in the cut, a bit more authority, whereas feels a little bit nimbler, which is interesting because it is 4 or 5 ounces heavier, something like that. But it moves around very quickly. And so does the Salzritter, but maybe just a little bit less quick. Pick it up. The weight distribution is a little bit different. The Principe, I feel a lot of weight in the hilt. I don't feel as much weight in the hilt here. I feel a little bit more weight in this area. And the sword does start a little bit thicker here at the base before tapering very quickly and then not having tons of distal taper. It does taper out, but it stays relatively thick, same thickness throughout a large part of it. The base of the blade, it starts thick and then tapers quickly. So all that to be said, I do feel that weight right here when I pick this up, whereas the Principe, I feel it more in the hilt itself. All right, bottom line, this sword and scabbard is priced at $5,000. Is it worth that price? This is a very difficult question to answer because for most people, the answer is going to be no. And in fact, for me, this specific sword and scabbard, I would not want to pay $5,000 for. But as I said in the Shalia review, it depends on what you're going for. And I can absolutely see myself commissioning something from Eric at around this price point. In fact, I've discussed a little bit with him, and there might be something coming in the future, but it really depends. That kind of price range requires a lot of thought and saving up for. So I haven't fully decided on that, but I could absolutely see myself commissioning something from Eric in this general price range. So yes, his work can be worth it, but it needs to really speak to you directly. I think this sword is a lot of fun, and it's much more up my alley than the Shalia that I reviewed, but it's still not quite hitting me in every spot that I would need for me to want to drop $5,000 on it. I want to talk about the scabbard a little bit more. I talked about it earlier, but this is something that I think a lot of people don't actually give credit for, is how much effort goes into the scabbard, especially one this decorated. This scabbard adds a lot to the overall price of the sword, and it's something that you're going to get if you want to order from Mr. Estlund. He really does consider swords incomplete without a scabbard, so he does want to include one, even if it may not be as decorated as this. You could have something like the Shalia that has a much simpler scabbard, or the other sword that I'll be reviewing in 2 weeks that also has a simpler scabbard. But regardless, adding the cost of a scabbard to a commission you can't even really break this down into the sword costs $3,000 and the scabbard costs $2,000 because it's a complete pair. The set costs $5,000. Mr. Estlund doesn't want to break the price down like that because it's one package. It's not two separate things. And I can respect that idea. This is the way he wants to put his work together, the way he wants to do his projects. And when I'm commissioning something from an individual maker, I want them to have a large say in the project. I might have the basic vision for the project, but I'm choosing a specific maker because I want their particular brand and sense of aesthetic and art and all that. I want them to put their heart into the weapon and make it their own based off my general ideas. So you have to really want to pair your specific project you want with the correct smith. And I do think Mr. Estlund is the correct smith for certain things. He has a very specific aesthetic and sense of style that really makes his swords look authentic medieval swords. It's something that I don't see very often from most modern makers. They tend to have a sense of style that doesn't quite nail that look as much as Mr. Estlund does. Now, that's not to say they don't look authentic. It's just that Eric's work has just that little bit extra. If the other people are 99% of the way authentic, Eric looks 100% authentic, if you get what I mean. We're talking very minor details or differences here, but it is there, and it is something I want to point out. And that's going to wrap up this review. Once again, a huge thank you to Eric for sending me these swords and letting me review them. Also, thank you for watching. If you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe, hit the like button, leave a comment. Check out alien2.com. Until next time, Alien2 out.